Perfect. And we're live on Facebook and YouTube. Oh, good. Steve is watching. He had left some very related notes like 10 minutes ago. So that seemed like bizarrely good timing for the session that we're about to start.
True.
So welcome to the Wikilection live stream on politics. So this is, I guess, the second in the three-part series that we keep cycling through between news, politics, and science. So we're going to be focusing on politics today, but we will briefly touch on some of the sort of science or controversial topic discussion items towards the end, because that probably aligns a bit closer with the project that Susan is working on.
Yeah, thank you, Adriel, for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
As a UX designer and specialist, with a focus on information architecture, of course, I welcome any opportunity to do a UX test on anything. So, yes, thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining. Your input is bizarrely well focused on what we're going to be talking about today. So that's good. Let me make sure I got this up. All right, let me share my screen. I'll have to. Okay, good. Switches off to that automatically. All right. So in these presentations, we just sort of go through the different sections of a slide deck that's split into sort of three different sections, and we can jump around as necessary, like especially if you have questions about, sort of how we would achieve certain things. Just a quick intro to the idea of these live streams in general. So the goal is to provide, any guests, but also anyone watching with information about Wikilection, and then to help improve the design of both, the resulting application and sort of what plans we have in mind, but then also get better at explaining it. That's personally one of the main reasons to do it, is to just keep sort of iterating and improving the explanation so that each time it makes better and better sense, and we're getting closer to what people need and to being able to sort of explain why it's important. And then we just, as it says here, we present the topic in its current state. We'll answer any questions and receive feedback, both from live guests, from comments as it's being streamed later on. And then in between now and the next time we talk about this topic, I'll refine the plan, sort of probably update some of the infographics and diagrams. And then the next time it's covered, the goal is that it's a little bit more refined and improved. So I guess we can do a quick intro. So the end goal of Wikilection is to use evidence to fight misinformation. And in this context, because it sort of bleeds into all the areas, evidence refers to any information that we can use to prove something is true. So common examples include like actual scientific reports, something that journalists might use, like eyewitness testimony, video interviews, and then things that are actually sort of important data that's available to the public, like court records and government data, whether that's on spending, how somebody voted, that kind of thing. So let me scroll here down to the section on politics. It's towards the end, perfect. So in these slides, we'll be talking about what kind of information will be available for elections, political parties, and the politicians themselves. Before we dive in, let me just check the comments here. Perfect. Yeah. See there, Steve. Steve agrees. That's good. And if you have any questions, Susan, as we go, feel free to chime in. Or if you see any comments, please feel free to bring them up if they look important. Because in my current setup, I have a single screen that I'm switching back and forth between the stream and the actual presentation.
Sure.
So we talked about this. Now, when we're talking about what kind of information is available for politics, we'll look at, I guess, what I'm just calling the political history in general, which is split into politicians and political parties. Now, more information will be available about the politicians themselves. One of the most important and probably popular things that will be tracked are the funding sources of the politicians and just any industry ties they have, right? So like who funded their campaign, have they been getting donations while they're in office, and just, their life before and even during politics. Do they have any ties to different industries or, lobbying groups, that kind of thing? And one of the things that we're looking for is through all the rest of the information available, are there any common themes, right? Like if they're getting a lot of money from a certain group, do we see that what they're actually doing well in office tends to align with that group and their interests? Other things that we'll be tracking for politicians, one thing is their campaign promises. So that, while the person's actually running the election campaign and they're trying to say, what they'll do if elected, we record that during the election. And then the person who wins, we can start to record what did they actually accomplish? Which of their campaign promises did they fulfill? We have things like spending priorities, which that is what are they actually spending, the public funds on? And what are they not spending funds on, right? What do they cut and what do they increase? That sort of thing. When it comes to legislation, which is something that we'll actually talk a bit about later on, where the legislation will need to be reviewed by the community to sort of say what it's about, right? Is this good for the environment? Is it good for business? Is it good for public health? Is it bad for certain things? So that we can learn, if you're voting for or against this, what does that show about your priorities? And then when it comes to politicians, we look at any legislation they drafted, sponsored, that sort of thing, and how they voted. And then combining that information, we can start to see common themes about what somebody either, they're actually actively working on legislation, drafting and sponsoring legislation in certain categories, or if they tend to vote for or against certain categories. We can again start to learn about their priorities that way. We'll track any positions they've appointed, and then the same sort of information will be available for those positions that were appointed instead of elected, and tied in some, in smaller amounts, but still tied to the person who appointed them, right? So if you appoint 6 people and they all do terrible jobs, that should probably reflect somewhat on the person who appointed them. We have what we're calling important events, which is actually what we'll be covering on the next slide. So I won't go into that too deep, but that's just, I guess, sort of important events that are worth keeping track of that don't really fit into any of the other groups. And then we have that person's experience. So that can be their education, that can be their career history. And this will also tie into any claims that they've made as sort of an expert, which ties into the science area. And we can start to track how accurate their claims are after they've been reviewed and how accurate they are on the topics that they're talking about. And then because a lot of these politicians tend to be a part of a political party, we can start to use the information available for politicians and then kind of group it together based on what party they're a part of. And sometimes parties just have their own history information as well. But things that we want to know about the parties are where does that party itself get its money from, and what industries does it have ties to? What are sort of the ongoing party platform, right? So if you can see election over election, even if you're cycling through different candidates and people spread across different areas, a lot of parties tend to have a fairly consistent platform. What is that platform? And then what's the leadership of the party? What does that look like? Which politicians are in charge? And you can have important events for political parties as well. Any questions before we jump to looking at important events?
Are you hoping to have this launched before September?
No.
No. In any kind of working form? Any kind of?
I mean, if we got an audience, we might be able to do bits and pieces. There's just too big of a bridge to gap between now and September, October to actually make it useful for the U.S. election. Mm-hmm. And candidly, it's kind of still in the early phases. So if we actually got something working, I'm not sure I would have enough faith in that early version beta to have it affect the U.S. election one way or another. I'd rather stay out of that until that's kind of the final test. That's you would start out doing sort of some local, probably municipal elections, and then maybe go to state and sort of start to ramp it up, where the end goal is to handle national ones. But that, in my mind, is kind of the last test, because I wouldn't want to skew that until it's ready and actually providing useful information.
Sure. Thanks.
No problem. Actually, one interesting thing that I've been considering doing, which I probably will, is there's probably going to be 2 different sort of versions of the political app, one being for real and one being for fictional characters. And the fictional character one is sort of where some of the new features would get released first, because they aren't actual people, so you can say whatever you want about them, test out features, and you don't have to worry about being sued or anything. And then on the actual history for people side, that would end up being sort of more member only to start with, while we're hashing things out and making sure it's accurate until there's enough people where we've thrown stones at it, it's solid, it seems to stand up to scrutiny, and then we'd start to work at making things public. So let me just go through some of these comments here. Okay, guess there's a similar project, Code for America Hack Nights, that there's a GitHub that might have some useful information. So this is an interesting comment. So that is a big scope for political history. There's a lot to it. One of the important things is with all of this, all the underlying data, I don't expect or even want, everyone to go in and review every layer of this. That's too much. And people just won't for the most part. So the end goal is to take all this, useful, reliable, reviewed information and use it as sort of the foundation, so that as we can do things like learn, about the categories of legislation that somebody voted for or against, when you're looking at a politician, you might just see, here's their category scores, right? They're good for the environment, but the oil and gas industry maybe doesn't like them. And then if you want, you can drill down into those categories to see why is it saying that, right? Because you can just say that somebody is good for this or bad for that, but why? Why should I believe that? You can then drill into, okay, here's a person's history in the environment. Here's how they voted for and against things, and here's why we're saying that. And then also things like where they got their money from, their ties, that sort of thing. And then there are a lot of apps that sort of cover individual things. And I think this, in a way, is sort of the reverse of the Big Brother conspiracy, right? Or I don't even know if it's a conspiracy anymore, because we know of things like PRISM, where it's, there's groups collecting information on people. This is sort of the same thing, but in the opposite direction, where it's people gathering information about those in power and those with control, so that we can start to sort of piece things together. And the more information there is in one sort of house, you can start to compare, like, oh, I want to compare their funding sources to their legislation history, their spending priorities, what they're promising in campaigns, which of the promises aren't fulfilled, that maybe because it would, take off a donor, that kind of thing. And then the market or niche, in this case, I think one of the unique things is the end goal is for this to be global and for it to be available in a bunch of different languages. So there's sort of a single point of truth. It's sort of meant to be like the IMDb for politics. So, so if you want to know about a certain politician, you go to one spot, it's got as much history as possible, and then things can start to bubble up to the top based on what kind of choices that person has made, the important things in that person's history, that sort of thing. I hope that answered your question. The political parties have their own systems for making decisions and voting. Some of them look like Reason Score. That is true. And I imagine that the political party part will, it's going to take a lot of information from the members, but then there's also things, right? Like in the US, there's, the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, gets in trouble or, sometimes gets kudos for certain decisions the actual party has made. It's not a particular politician. And we can then have a spot to track that under the party. And you can also say, for example, if somebody was running under a party umbrella, but their campaign platform conflicted with the party, you'd be able to show that. You'd be able to say, well, you're saying you're going to do this, but the person in charge, running for president or prime minister or whatever, has the opposite platform, so you won't actually be able to fulfill that, if that makes sense. There was a question if this is a, they're saying that it's good to sort of, I guess, use existing information to get information for parties, and then saying, are we still looking for a use case or a killer app or a example user, and is this a teaching product? I'm not sure what you mean by the use case. Like this, a lot of this is based on kind of my own personal use cases to start with, and then as I've had these sort of conversations and I learn other things that people would also want, then that's built into the design, or it's added to the data architecture so that we can make sure that's tracked. There's still going to be a lot of usability work to be done here because that's not really my thing. And then, is it a teaching product? In a way, yes. One of the important things, which we'll actually go over when we look at the election portion, is aside from it just showing here's who's running and here's their history, it's also meant to show, okay, this person is running for, let's say, president. Okay, here's what the president is. Here's the responsibilities they have. Here's how many positions they can appoint. Here's common skills that people say that role needs to have, so that when you're reviewing the people running for that role, you have something to compare it to. And then, you can see where people agree, where people disagree on what skills someone should have, that sort of thing.
So there is a strong educational component.
Right. Yeah. It's really meant to kind of show you everything you need to know in order to make a decision, which part of that is like, what am I actually voting on, right? Which positions are up for election in this election? Who is running, what roles and responsibilities does that role have? And then how should I compare those responsibilities to what the person can actually do? And when we get, go ahead.
And who is your ideal user? This question is example.
Really, the ideal user are people who are on the fence, right? If you're leaning one way or the other way really, strongly, you've probably already got an information source that you trust. So you're probably not going to be looking too hard into this. I mean, they're still welcome to, and I'm sure they'll want to chime in to make sure that their side of the story is heard. But in the end, it's meant for people who are undecided, the people who are actually trying to make a choice and they don't just vote, the same way every time. It's for them, at least on the politics side. And then it's kind of for the same thing for the science and the news part, where really it's meant to be sort of a source of information that you can trust, where it's using information from experts, from people, as good of an idea as we can have if something is true or not, and then trying to sort of summarize that so that people can start with a high level, drill down as much as they need to in order to have faith in what they're reading. Hope that answers the questions that are coming. Yeah, if you have some persona research on this, Steve, I would definitely like to see that. Part of the challenge here is that I've been having challenge actually getting, people involved to get the persona research and talk to people. So
exactly. So that's the first thing is.
Yeah. So part of this has been sort of designing it for myself to get, to have something to show, to get people interested so that I can get feedback and start to get that feedback loop going.
So you've basically worked out the conceptual part.
Right. Yeah. And then it's just going to be keeping going.
And now you're really into the UX in terms of research. So now you have to find the people to actually base your personas on.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Because who are the undecided? Male, female, what age?
Right, exactly. And there's probably going to be people in both groups who still lean one way or the other. But there's enough unknowns and there's enough of a trust vacuum that they're still kind of on the fence. It's really anybody in that undecided group is the key user, because people who aren't undecided probably don't need it, right? They can still participate, but I don't think that it's going to be as big of a want for them. There's this. So Steve is asking, or he's saying that there's already several IMDb for politics. What makes the idea different? I think one of the big ones, the ones I've seen, tend to be regional. So I've seen a bunch in the U.S. where either it's state-based or it's U.S.-based, and to my knowledge, I haven't seen it be super transparent as far as how they operate, what sort of way they're operating on, like, are they for profit, who's paying their bills, that sort of thing. And one of the big things that is a reason why, like, I personally am involved in both Wikilection and Together Tech, is I think Together Tech is going to end up solving a really key part where it's that trust. It's what do you need to trust a company that's trying to facilitate this conversation? And if the point is that we're being as transparent as possible, we're being funded by the public and not by, corporations and a couple of big donors, being transparent, like, in the money and how it operates, all the things that people need in order to trust. That's one big difference I haven't seen. And then, sorry, that I haven't seen in others. And another big part of the difference is sort of this, it's a lot more than politics. We'll get into a bit on, like, the scientific discussion and the controversial topics and sort of how we dissect those, and the news and getting feedback from experts. I think in its inception, it was probably very similar to the other IMDb for politics products. And then as I started to figure out what I would personally need to trust information that came out of it, it ballooned quickly into these things that at first glance didn't really have to do with each other, but they all depend on each other to be able to provide that trust.
And what does IMDb stand for?
IMDb is the Internet Movie Database. So that's like, if you do a search for Brad Pitt or, Arnold Schwarzenegger or whoever on Google, that's usually the first hit. And that's sort of like the general Hollywood, and even I think Bollywood, and like anything to do with movies and TV. The actors, producers, directors, they're all on there. And you can see, like, things they've acted in, things they've directed, things they've produced, things they did the soundtrack for. It's like a full history of that person's relationship to, like, Hollywood and the media.
And who populates that? Like, who is that? That's crowdsourced, or
I think it's partially crowdsourced, but there's also a company behind it. I think Amazon owns IMDb now. Some big company owns that now. So I think it's mostly their staff, but I believe it's partially like crowdsourced, and then there's people that actually go in there and review it and decide what gets published or not. But I hope that answers your question about how this is different from the other projects. And there's a ton of sort of different niche areas that Wikilection is touching that I've seen. There's quite a few good tools in that top in those areas. Like in the area of political information, there's Ballotpedia, there's Voters Edge, there's a ton of other that I'm forgetting, and they're really, really good at what they do. The goal of Wikilection is to add a layer of information to make it really transparent about where the information is coming from. And then also some seemingly unrelated things that might make more sense later on as we start to talk about some of the other features. This one, okay. Steve wants to have a conversation about how to solve politics by making everything a public poll, which I'm all for. In the end, one of the things about Wikilection is the goal is to have as few people sort of behind the scenes deciding what gets published or not, because then that's an area where it can be gamed one way or the other. There's other things that are sort of planned to make crowdsourcing work a little bit better, hopefully, but that will be one of the main challenges to solve, is how to sort of get that information from the crowd in a way that's not as prone to, to gaming and trolling and that sort of thing.
So then to collect that information, are you looking at algorithms like mining? Like, how are you gonna?
To collect which information, sorry?
Like all of these different aspects of the
I see what you mean.
history, education, like.
Some of it will be available through official sources. So things like in legislation, the goal is wherever possible to point that to the official source, right? So like here's where on the government website, here's what they say the
so a lot of
legislation
links, is. So you'll be linking out.
It would go out and grab it. It would be linking out, but wherever possible and legal, we want to be able to sort of snapshot a version ourselves. So if it changes, we know, it wasn't that way when we first snapshotted it. Here's what we snapshotted when it was first created and linked.
Okay.
But then, yeah, it would still need to link out, and that's true for the legislation. When we get into the controversial topic discussion, that's true of scientific papers or treaties or whatever is being reviewed.
Mm-hmm.
And then for things like campaign promises, important events, a lot of that will rely on crowdsourcing and the member community, where there's going to be a lot of different groups where some people will submit stuff, other people will have to sort of, I guess, parse the information and flag certain things and sort of, categorize it. And then groups of people will review it and sort of say how accurate it is and is it trustworthy, and, all the sort of metadata research on like who actually created that piece of legislation or the scientific paper and so on. And Steve made a good comment here, saying people who are undecided are usually apathetic and won't spend much time. I both agree and don't agree. So I agree that is the current state. I think one of the issues that we're facing now, like especially with things like COVID-19 and climate change and everything, is we're operating in a trust vacuum. And so you've got sort of two choices there.
A broken information ecology.
Right. And so let me actually switch here because I've got a diagram that sort of helps it explain this. So we're operating in something that works a bit like this in my mind, right? Where you've got, let's say, two different information sources, and they're saying very different things. Now, not every information source is exposed to every person. So over on the right here, you've got sort of a bar graph showing, the whole population. And this part in the middle is showing, how much of the population is exposed to that information source. So this top part here, they're only exposed to information source A. So that's what they believe, right? They believe it wholeheartedly. They haven't seen anything conflicting with that. And the story is being told in such a way that, it makes a compelling argument. So they believe whatever that is. The group on the bottom, they're only being exposed to channel B. They believe, whatever that is. And again, there's nothing conflicting. So groups A and B believe what their information sources tell them because there's nothing conflicting. And in this example, those are generally going to be the people who are firmly in one camp or another. But then you've got these people in the middle where they've gotten some exposure to both sides, and they're saying, well, wait, that conflicts. So either someone's wrong or someone's lying, or they're both lying. And these are the people in my experience who are undecided. And right now, without going and doing hours of research, they don't really have a good way to tell what's true and what's not, or who to trust. And even if you've got a news source that you hope you can trust, all it takes is a couple instances of showing, oh, they're not trustworthy on this topic, or talking about this person, or they refuse to talk about a certain topic, where you start to lose trust in, oh, they're not operating as a media outfit. They're operating as a for-profit company where they're just doing anything to, keep the lights on and make someone dollars. And maybe that's not the best source of information that, if I actually want a full snapshot of where things are at. So the end goal is to provide that group enough information that when they look at it, there's enough information available at the bottom level that if they want to dig deep, they can see the underlying information. And there's no one group deciding what gets published or not published or how to skew certain articles. So the end goal is that you'll get exposed to a lot of stuff that you don't agree with, but you also get exposed to stuff that you do agree with. And the goal there is to show that you aren't seeing it through that same biased lens. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Do you know if there's any studies that have been done? There must be on this undecided group. There must be already existing.
I think there's a ton. Personally, I don't trust any of it, because if you see what that same group says about how to talk to them and the things they care about, that's really what every election is about. It's about the undecided.
Exactly.
And you can see that the people that talk about them don't really know how to talk to them or how to position it, because it seldom goes exactly the way that that group thinks it will. But a big part of it is, trying to get people to actually start to confirm these beliefs, or if I'm wrong, then to be able to adjust. Because right now, the main goal is just to get an audience to be able to start asking these questions. So the people whose ears perk up when they start to hear this, even if they're firmly in one camp or another, I still want them, in a vote. I still want them participating in the conversation. I don't want to rely totally on one group or another, because if things start to come out where somebody who's participating starts to see some of the articles are weighing against them, they might sort of lose faith and think, oh, it's actually, it's biased against me. I don't want to participate. Where I think in the end, it will probably end up being skewed one way or the other, but I don't think it's going to be, 90-10. I think it's going to be like 70% at most in one group and 30, or the gap might be smaller into sort of whose beliefs actually hold up to scrutiny.
Are you aware that I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Jim Rutt and a couple of his colleagues actually started a political party? That was the foundation for the whole Game B project.
Okay. I heard someone say something about a party that had started, so I think that may have been brought up very briefly.
So you might reach out to him or to people that knew about that and see, what they knew about their so-called users.
Right. Yeah.
If they were in that undecided, I'm assuming a lot of them would. I mean, that's why I usually create a third party or another political party to offer an option, right?
Right. Yeah. I think that's
thinking within the Game B group, there should be a lot of undecideds who might.
I would think, yeah, and even people who are fairly decided still seem to be fairly open to at least discussion. In even the few people that have seen who are rigid, they're still open to discussion. They're still, somewhat and. Personally, that's all I need to be able to talk. If you're open to something, open to discussion, and not completely rigid, then I think that's definitely a useful voice to have in the project. Right. Okay. Yeah, I should probably get back to the actual presentation. That was a good side tangent, though. All right. So we talked about the political history. Now, we talked a bit about the important events for both politicians and political parties, and here's an example of sort of how that might be presented from a very early days, conceptual screenshot. I would be very surprised.
I didn't zoom in on that because I'm seeing a screen and a screen and a screen.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. Let me see. Yeah, that's quite small. That was the wrong way. Yeah, I can just go. That doesn't do it. Oh, there we go. There's Zoom. All right, we'll see if that works.
Oh, that looks way better. Thank you.
And then how do I just use these things? Okay, so starting up top. So this is the example of sort of one of the views for a candidate, where in this case it's someone named Stephen Connor, who's running for re-election of mayor. We're looking at an example called Top Events in the top right. And you can see right below that, there's sort of a timeline showing that person's experience, right? So they started off as a teacher, and then moved to school board, and then city council, and then became mayor. Underneath that, you can see some important events being sort of highlighted on that timeline. So the first example there for the fundraising record, you can see that line leads to a spot right after their first re-election to the school board, where they did a really good job at fundraising for the school board. And you can see that's given this person some bonuses to their finances and charity categories. So we're saying, hey, here's an example of something good that person did. In the next example called excessive expenses, you're seeing there's actually 3 separate examples spread out over this person's 2 terms as a council member. And in this case, that is giving them a negative to their finances. And there's some stuff underneath showing people voting on the importance, that sort of thing. And if I scroll down here, this is where it's actually, so this excessive expenses event is being sort of supported by 3 pieces of news, right? So we're saying, hey, there were 3 different articles on this in the local news spread across 3 different years. So there's, some backing to this. And this was, a sort of probably, these stories would have been based on information from the city government saying, here's something that happened. So there would also be most likely even more supporting information underneath that, actually from the government. And then technically you could go into the individual, news articles or clips if you really wanted to. But this is an example of there's a single event for excessive expenses. In this example, it actually happened 3 times. And then you can see underneath the evidence that's backing it up, so that you can't just say anything you want about a person. You do have to have evidence to back it up. Now, another example of this, we actually move to the example next to it, which is abuse of power. And in this case, it's saying, okay, shortly after becoming mayor, this person actually fired the comptroller that made the previous complaints about spending, right? And sounds very realistic. You can see that there's some, that leaves maybe the person's ethics as questionable. But in this case, because of how the court case turned out, it's only suspected. Now, this is, again, sort of early days screenshot. If something was only suspected and didn't actually have enough information, it probably wouldn't show up here at all. It would still be on file so that we can sort of track information for and against it. But it wouldn't show up as default on the timeline. There's likely going to end up being some sort of a spectrum of like how sure we are did this happened, from like that we're sure it didn't happen because there's a bunch of evidence to the contrary, to in the middle, like we're really not sure. Some people say yes, some people say no, to that we're very sure there's a whole bunch of evidence. Everyone that has disagreed has been debunked one way or another. There's going to be a point where the community says, okay, we want to see these where we're fairly sure into like that we're absolutely sure, if that made any sense.
Nope, that makes sense.
And so based on how sure we are, that controls if it shows up or not. But the idea here being there's multiple pieces of news that are about that story. And even if if you think about someone like Donald Trump, where anything he does that's good or bad, there's going to be 1,000 news articles about it. And almost always they won't agree if that thing was good or bad. So the idea here is that you can have a single event saying the thing that happened, that you can sort of capture all the underlying information about the news articles discussing it, the evidence for or against, if it happened or didn't happen, or just if it's good or bad. That gives sort of the bucket to put all that information into, so that if there's 1,000 articles about one thing and maybe only 2 articles about something else that maybe also be important, you aren't getting that lost in the ether of those 1,000 articles about this one thing. That one event now only becomes a single dot on that person's history. And then, if it's important, it still shows up as being weighted heavily. But just because everyone was talking about it doesn't mean that the other things don't also need discussion. Does that put the important events in a bit more context?
Yep, for sure. Looks good.
Okay, we'll do this. And so the next one is actually something that I'll be screenshotting. Somebody asked about something similar in the Game B space, asking if, or in I think it was Game B projects, asking if they knew of a tool like this. I don't, so that's why it's a part of this as a mock-up. This is an example of something that might be used as evidence, and sort of how we're able to look at some certain pieces of content, in this case, a video recording. Let me get this positioned right with the zoom in. So this is an example of a video from, again, the same person as the previous example, Stephen Connor, from a campaign rally while he was running for re-election as mayor. So underneath, you can see the typical player, that you might see on something like YouTube, where you have your play button, your timeline, and a little thing that travels along showing how far you are on that timeline. But what's unique here is underneath, there's what we call snippets. And these are things that the community has highlighted as important segments of that video. So you can see here, it's just entered the spot where it's starting to play through snippet number 3. And underneath, you can see that in this spot, Stephen is making a claim that traffic is better. So in context of it got better during his time as mayor. Now, the community is not only flagged it, they've also reviewed it. And we can see it says, okay, you didn't give any sources that we can prove or disprove. So we just kind of have to go based on what the community says, and the overall community review and sort of the outcome is that, yeah, he made some minor improvements to the outlying roads, but the downtown area, which is the main issue, has gotten far worse. So it's actually worse overall. So to say that it's better is mostly false, it says in the top right. Now, not everything can necessarily be proven true or false. You scroll over to the right here, it lists all of the claims made or all of the things talked about, and you can see snippets 2 and 5 are actually for campaign promises. So those can't be proven true or false yet, but what they can do is serve as proof that the promise was made. So when we're tracking what campaign promises this person ran on, for example, we might see that for Stephen, one campaign promise was a new arena for number 2, and one campaign promise was emergency preparation. So that, you know, as more and more of these campaign rallies happen, he's always talking about the new arena and emergency preparation. Those are then recorded as campaign promises. If there's ever any, like, I never made those promises, you know, I don't have to fulfill it because I didn't say that. We now have a catalog of proof saying, here's the 38 rallies you said that at, and the video clips for each.
Nice.
And then there's things like here where there's other ways to review it. So claim 1 is saying crime is down, and the community said, even if that's true, it's unrelated, right? You didn't do anything to do that. Maybe we just have a really good, you know, chief of police. So why are you talking about that? And then item number 4, that actually is somewhat true. There's an art crawl that maybe the mayor arranged, so he is able to take credit for it, and it was good. It maybe, you know, generated some funds and interest. So that one actually is good. So we're getting kind of a snapshot of, okay, here are the items like 2 and 5 that aren't true or false, but they're just being captured for later use. And then like items 1, 3, and 4, these are things that are actually not just being checked if they're true, but also checked if the context of, for example, in item number 1 saying crime is down, even if that's true, is it contextually true in how it's being presented, like if Stephen is taking credit for it. And then up top, you can see some of the basic summaries, like saying, you know, where it came from and what tags there were. And then you would likely have some sort of a summary saying, like, of all the claims made in this video, here's the percentage, you know, truth from 0 to 100 or whatever scale ends up being used. So that when you're just looking at a video, before you even start playing it, you can know going into it how accurate is this video, and possibly how accurate is it for certain topics that I might care about. Does that make sense? Any questions about that sort of content review piece?
Nope, not right now. Looks good.
Right. Next we'll move on to the election part. Oh, let me zoom back out. So when it comes to elections, there's the 3 different sort of, I can't even say groups, but I guess 3 levels that we're talking about. So one of the most important things here are the election issues. And these can mostly come from 3 sources. There's things that are actually ballot measures, right? So if it's like a you know, proposition 1, 2, 3 on the ballot that people are voting for, that's an important issue to track, where we're saying, you know, here's what people are saying about the for and against, and the proof behind it, and how that, you know, how accurate that is, and so on. There's things that maybe they aren't ballot measures, but something that is being brought up in the media, right? So if the media is talking about, like, oh, this is an important topic that people are asking about, and that thus the politicians are talking about, that's tracked as well, so that we can start to track their answers on, or their stances on those issues. And then if it's not a ballot measure and the media is not talking about it, it's still very possible that there's issues that the community wants to know about and track stances on, that the community needs a way to be able to sort of bubble up to the top and say, hey, this is also important, so the community can submit their own topics and vote on how important those topics are for that election. So it gives people, you know, outside of the media, the ability to sort of say, hey, 5,000 voters also have this question, maybe you want to chime in here as well. Mm-hmm. Now, for those issues, part of what we'll need to be able to do is track the topics or the categories that that issue is for, right? So is this a business issue? Is this environmental? Is it both? And then within each topic, the community can rank how important that issue is to that topic, right? So maybe something is super important, to the environmentalists and moderately important to business, or maybe specifically to oil and gas people. So you can rank and say, if you care about the environment, you're definitely going to care about this. If you care about oil and gas, you might care. If you don't care about either, you're probably not going to care about that certain election issue. Now, that's one thing being tracked that we'll go over in the next screenshot roughly, but we're also talking about the roles that are up to vote on. And this goes a bit back to a previous question on about the education component, and this is where that mostly lies. So for the roles, we're tracking what responsibilities that role has. Now the end goal, because I've done some work in sort of working with local governments, and there's really no one way or 10 ways that local governments work. They're vastly different state to state and county to county, and it's very up to interpretation. They're strong mayors, and you can call them weak or ceremonial mayors, that sort of thing. So there would end up being sort of a generic, here's what mayors do. And then you might have a more specific, hey, here's what mayors in California usually do. And then even a more specific, here's what mayors in, San Francisco do. And if you don't have those lower levels, it can still show here's what mayors usually do. But the end goal is to have it be as detailed as possible for that specific election and the role that person is serving. Because with the example of strong mayors and ceremonial mayors, very different rights and responsibilities. Although I guess in that example, you don't usually vote for a ceremonial mayor, but that's a separate thing. So along with the responsibilities, that starts to highlight some of the skills that are going to be required, right? If part of the responsibility is, creating, drafting, and voting on legislation, you probably need some capacity to understand legislation, right? So that's where you see a lot of politicians come from legal backgrounds. If somebody's, going into the role of a clerk or the comptroller or whatever role it is, that they're going to have certain responsibilities that indicate what skills they should have, which then hopefully tells you what to look for on the candidates competing for that role. Now, as well, within a certain role, because you've got your responsibilities and skills involved, and we know what election issues are important to people voting in that election, you can start to get an idea of where those things overlap, right? So if there's an election issue about how are we going to afford a certain thing, maybe that's not a question for the clerk, but it is a question for the comptroller. So you can start to separate, even though the clerk could chime in if they have an opinion. The idea here is to highlight, here's what the community said is an important issue, and here are the roles being voted on that are really sort of integral in figuring out and implementing whatever solution we decide on. And then finally, indicating which other positions that role gets to appoint. So if we're talking about mayor, maybe they get to appoint 6 positions. So as well as saying, here's the responsibilities that they're doing, here's also, in a way, the responsibilities that they end up assigning, and so that's also why this role is important. And then we get to sort of the lower level underneath that, which are going to be the candidates competing for a certain role. And that's where you have some information like we talked about so far, like their experience, either education, career history, that sort of thing, what platform they're running on. So what are the reasons that they're listing for why you should vote for them over somebody else, and especially their campaign promises. What are that person's stances on the election issues, especially the ones that the community has decided are important. A history of how accurate their claims tend to be. So as politicians are saying, 78% of people do this, or, this recent study shows that if we don't do X, then Y is going to happen. As actual expert members of the community start to review those claims, we can start to get an idea on how accurate each candidate's claims are overall, but then also per area. Like if the person knows a lot about, the law, so they can start to talk about legislation and about what a certain law might mean, maybe they aren't that good, at biology. So if they're chiming in a conversation that requires knowledge about that, be aware of that, and then also track how accurate is this person when they're talking about biology, or maybe, specifically a virus issue, that kind of thing. And then if we know who some of their appointees are going to be, we can track that. And going back to the kind of very start slide, any funding sources that we know of during the election, tracking those and making that information available. Let's try the comments here. So the next slide is, again, and let me zoom in here again, an early mock-up for what the sort of main election screen might look like. So here's an example going to that same election that Stephen Connor was in for mayor. So here it's going to list the roles being voted on. So you can see that mayor is being sort of highlighted by the arrow. And then underneath that, there's the city attorney, and there's 4 council member seats up for voting. It's got some information about how long the term is and what some of the things that person does. And then in the top right of each box, you can see who's in office right now, are they running for re-election, and how many candidates are there. So just sort of a general overview of the role and what's up with it, how many people are there, you know, what to consider. On the right, you can see the election topics, where it can show sort of how popular it is, what the topic actually is, and then you'd be able to drill into that topic and see the, you know, more sort of detailed information, a description about the issue, and then as well, all of the different stances from the relevant candidates competing in the election on that topic.
So the numbers on the far right, they indicate what? Information sources? That plus like 37 next to road maintenance?
That's just meant to be sort of like the popularity, right? So like 37 people have voted that road maintenance is an important issue in this election. And that's a really early, it will likely end up being per topic. As I said, this is actually probably one of the first mock-ups that was made. So this is back in the you know, super simple Reddit style, just vote up and down. I don't think it'll able to be that easy, but that's just, yeah, an example of kind of how popular the item is. It might end up being able to show something like that, but instead of it just showing one number, it would show you the scores of the topics that you've said that you care about, right? So if you say, I only care about environmentalism, then you would see the scores on topics based on how important that topic is to environmentalism, that kind of thing. So on the next screen, we'll actually look at, like, if you were to click on mayor here, what that next screen would look like, showing the information available for people competing for that role. So up top, I see. One second, scroll down. All right, interesting. So up top, we have more information about that role. It's got the, you know,
zoom in a little bit more.
That might be it. All right, we'll see if that's good. So we can tell that top bar is just showing some basic information that it showed on the previous screen as well. You have a bit more detailed information about the responsibilities, the roles, you know, what kind of skills they might have. And that's to be up top, because the idea is that's about the role. And so anybody competing for it is going to have these responsibilities, is going to have probably these skills, that sort of thing. And then underneath, we're listing the actual people competing. So in this case, it's comparing three candidates in each column. It's kind of highlighting Stephen Connor as the incumbent in the first column. And then it sort of goes through and it puts the comparable information in a row so that you can compare apples to apples. I've seen some tools that kind of try to do this. I haven't seen anything where it kind of looks clean and it arranges it in a grid. So the examples I saw, it had like one person had very limited information, and it was more just arranging it in a column. So it was actually hard to like compare experience to experience and term to term and priorities to priorities. It was kind of jumbled. I have seen some tools that do something sort of like this though. So in the examples here, you can see like the experience, that's a pretty basic one. We're just having a list of, you know, their roles, not much to go through there. In the previous term, here's an example of it showing kind of trying to summarize how that person did. So you can see for Stephen Connor here, he actually had the previous term. So we're able to look at things like the campaign promises. And in here, he's got a dismal 15% rating for fulfilling it, where you can see he had 3 promises: transportation improvements, new parks, and emergency preparation. He kind of got started on the transportation improvements, but that one's only 34%. So, you know, it was started, maybe partially completed. So we got some points there. 0% towards new parks. It was abandoned. And then the emergency preparation only got 12% along the way. It's been postponed. And if you remember from before, now that's one of his campaign promises this time around. So in this case, it gives you a bit more information that when you're looking at the current top priorities from Stephen Connor, just maybe keep in mind that the last election, he fulfilled 15% of them. And then it can be hard when you're comparing an incumbent to other people because they won't have that same kind of information. So in this case, it's just showing sort of their comments on the last one. There would likely need to be some sort of a heavier comparison on sort of the skills they have versus the skills that they need to hopefully give an apples to apples, but I don't have a mock-up for that yet. But we can see a few more examples where there's like their top 3 priorities. So effectively kind of their campaign platform. We can look at sort of a high-level summary of their campaign contributions, where this is an area where you would want to be able to drill in, right? So if I see that Stephen here got more than half of his campaign contributions from businesses, I might want to be able to drill in there and see which businesses they were, what industries that they're tied to, that sort of thing. We can see their tags. So you can see here that Stephen is not doing great in the finance area, and that's partially based on their previous examples of the important events where he got in trouble for overspending. And then there's some questions about his ethics because he fired the person who was questioning his finances. Mm-hmm. And then it's got some tags for the other people, but not as much information is available because they weren't in an elected office. So there's just not as much available for them. We can go into things like actual political experience, where it's giving, again, the timeline of when they were in an elected position, and then again, trying to give some sort of a score so that you can say, here's how happy the public was with their job in that role, which is probably somewhat tied to their campaign promises, but then also whatever else the community feels they need in order to accurately judge how someone fulfilled the role. I'm guessing it won't be as simple as just, a 0 to 100% with a color coding, but this, I think, helps get the idea across of the end goal is just to be able to summarize that so that you can see not just their experience, but how they actually did it in those roles. Right underneath that, you can see another version of that where it's not how they did, but anybody that they appointed, how did that person do? Because you might have somebody who's great at their role, but if they're assigning people who aren't good, well, that really counts against them because, if they're appointing important roles and those roles are failing, well, maybe those roles wouldn't have failed if they appointed better people. And that's kind of a part of who they are as a politician in a way. And then the final row is showing an example of an election issue where in this case, someone's asking about the infrastructure financing because one of the important issues was road maintenance. And so people asking, how would you pay for it? Now, this is an example of an important question that maybe people voted on, and you can see only one person has answered it. So that can show that, like, if you can start to have the public and the community start to ask questions and vote on what's the most important, and then we start to highlight those questions, it can give the politicians and their team some incentive to start answering maybe questions that they wouldn't have otherwise, because this can look bad if this is a really important issue. And people who are going here say, okay, I'm not sure what Stephen is doing. Apparently, he's not talking about it. But this person in the middle here is, in theory, that adds a bit more credence to their, like, oh, okay, they actually are paying attention to that topic. And this will hopefully help drive the conversation a bit more, where instead of the media deciding what gets talked about, this gives the public a bit more input into no one's asking this question, but everyone is asking it.
More accountability.
Exactly. And more sort of almost like an executive summary for voters. So the same sort of thing that a CEO might want to figure out how their company is doing from their department heads. The ability to have that same sort of a summary on how are these politicians doing? How did they, did they actually fulfill what they're supposed to be doing? So that you can figure out, just like a CEO might, maybe who's not pulling their weight and should be replaced. But in the case of politics, you do that during elections.
Nice.
So that is the basics of the politics part. I did want to quickly dive into, scroll past it. There we go. The controversial science part, just because this gets into a bit of the actual reviewing of the content, specifically like more skilled stuff, things that you kind of actually need some training and expertise in order to understand and or be trusted in what you're saying about what that means. Now, when I'm talking about this topic now, I've just started to call it science to make it sort of easier to understand the starting point, but it's not meant for only science. It's meant to sort of dissect and understand complex topics. So this, goes into like scientific studies, but it also goes into legislation, treaties, even possibly things like, a source that a journalist might use, anything that we as a community would need to understand more about that source and why you should trust one over another. This is kind of meant to be the area where that can happen.
Nice.
The diagramming isn't great here. Let me zoom in even more. See, so on the left, this is actually a screenshot from what I would say is probably the worst of the 3 mockups for Wikilection, just because there's not a lot of great examples for it yet. But the left is meant to be an example of something like, again, a scientific study or legislation.
Can you zoom in a little bit, please?
I wonder if there's I want to zoom out a little bit less. That's fine. Okay, we'll try this. So this is meant to be sort of a snapshot of some important content you might be reviewing. So in this case, it might be, let's say, a scientific study. You have things like the name of it, the title that people would use to reference it. You might have to link out to a certain file, especially with something like a scientific study where somebody else might own the rights to it. We might only be able to link out to it. But the end goal is whenever possible, we would want to actually have our own copy of it so that if things ever get changed or the source disappears, we still have our own copy. And we can tell if somebody changed the source, because that's a dishonest way to do things, but it's not to say that people won't. And then as well, there's a count of how many snippets have been flagged in this specific article and how many full reviews have been done, which we'll talk about in a second. And then underneath that, there's the intro, the actual body of the content, where that would actually be the full body, right? So for a scientific study, there might be 20 pages worth of sort of text and diagrams and whatnot, but that's meant to be the actual, just like showing the content that would be reviewed. And then underneath for that piece of content, you've got your snippets, which work a bit like the previous example of the snippets in a video, where you're taking segments of that content and saying, oh, these 2 sentences here, I want to be able to sort of reference them and say, oh, well, here's what was said. That part's true. That part's not true. Here they're referencing, a different study. We can link out to that study and see, is it true? Is it being accurately represented? That sort of thing. And then you can also have a full review where if it's a scientific study and you've gone through maybe, cherry pick 10 parts that you want to talk about, you still want to give a sort of an overview of the whole thing, where the reviews would allow you to do that. Let me zoom over to the right here and zoom out one.
So the reviews, when you say member reviews, you're talking about users?
Yeah, users. Now, specifically, I kind of use 2 terms somewhat interchangeably, which are members and experts. And experts technically don't even need to be members, because if it's just like somebody on the news talking about something and we have their name, then we say, oh, that person said this. We can go and check how qualified they are, check, their schooling, stuff that they've been right about, stuff they've been wrong about, sort of build that history for the experts. Then we can sort of know, oh, 80% of the time that this person is talking about biology, they tend to be accurate. And the person that's disagreeing with them is only correct 12% of the time. Okay, I know who I can probably trust here. But there's also just the members can review things themselves. And one of the goals there is that even if you're not technically qualified, if you're willing to sort of say, hey, I think this, I'm going to make this claim, I'm going to, actually carve this in stone, as it were, saying, I'm claiming this, I think that this is going to happen. If somebody who's not qualified, but they're still consistently correct, and they chime in on a topic, I still want to make sure that's reflected. because like there's things where I think it was during the 2008, 2012 election.
Snippets.
Sorry?
I said there are sense-making snippets then.
Right.
In that case.
Exactly. But like for example, somebody like Nate Silver, right, where sort of he kind of came out of the woodwork, and I think he technically is qualified in certain areas. But even if he wasn't, if he was able to make those kind of accurate predictions and make them publicly so that he can't go back later and say, oh, I guessed everything right, but I just didn't say it at the time, as opposed to if you're willing to say publicly, here's what I think is going to happen before we know the result, and then we see the result and we can start to track who's accurate. That's where we can start to learn, oh, certain members might not have any like qualifications, but they're consistently correct. So we can decide as a community what we want to do with that kind of feedback. But so that's sort of where, when I'm talking about members and experts, how sometimes they're kind of used interchangeably. So when we're looking at the studies themselves, we talked about the content, which is the actual study itself. There's also going to be some metadata or some sort of cataloging information for like who wrote it, who paid for any research or that sort of thing. All the stuff that's not contained in the study itself, but that's still important information to know, and that we might actually report on later on. So that's an example of the study itself. And I will zoom in here again so we can. Can I choose how much it's going to zoom? Okay, we'll see. So this is an example of a review. It's a very short one because eventually I want to have some actual proper things that are, actual studies that are being snapshotted in review here, because I just used some fake lorem ipsum text for the study. But so here's a review. It's sort of meant to be a review of the full study. So you can see, that there's the content that has been studied. There's how many snippets are sort of being included in this person's review. There's what they called their review, who actually did the review, so that we can then go and compare their review to what we know about that member or that expert. And then there's sort of a long form where I just typed a sentence or two here as an example. But this could sort of be almost like an editorial or an opinion piece saying what you think the general summary of this piece of content is, which is sort of what we're used to seeing if somebody reviews a scientific study. They sort of go do all their work, and then we just see their editorial saying, it's good, it's bad, they lied about this, they told the truth about this, sort of as a big essay. The goal here is that you have your same spot to have the editorial, but then for the specific parts, you can say like, oh, okay, in this specific part here, where here's the snippet, the person can look into that particular snippet, what they think about that. And the nice thing there is that you can then have, let's say, 10 reviews on the same piece of content. Well, if 5 of them talk about the same snippet, now you can start to get an idea on what do multiple people think about this thing. Oh, 2 of them don't like it, 3 of them do. Oh, and the 2 people that don't like it aren't qualified and don't seem to know the topic. And the 3 people that do agree are very qualified. It again can start to paint that picture. And then I think actually, some reviews. Yeah, okay. So if we're talking about the reviews, there's the overview itself, where it is, it allows the author to provide, again, sort of the essay or the editorial to sort of paint the picture overall. And then we track information about the author, so we can go over information that I talked about, like their qualification, previous reviews, and possible conflicts of interest. And then if we're looking at the snippets in a bit more detail, so here is an example of what a specific snippet might look like in more detail. So again, it's got the snippet name, where that would, in theory, be how people normally reference it. So a common way people will use snippets is if there's a really popular study and people like to cite, that same stat where it's like, 72% of people who encounter X do Y. That's sort of meant to be a certain snippet. We're saying here's a piece of the study people like to quote, and then you can review, well, how accurate is that part saying that 72% of people do X?
I love the context part.
Right, yeah, that's an important part. So you've got the full snippet where it's the full, so like the full sentence or 2 sentences you might see in the article, but then people love to take things out of context, where if it says 72% of people surveyed did X, but maybe if you read the previous example, you'll see that that 72% was actually only 10% of people surveyed. So we're actually talking about a percentage of a percentage. And if you say 72% of people, that's just straight up wrong, because that's not what the study might say. So it starts to make it harder to use things out of context. And then for this certain snippet, you can then see who are all the people that have given the reviews on that snippet. So, if it's a really popular one, you might have 100 people giving a review. That starts to give a really good example of what the qualified experts are saying, where they agree, where they don't agree, and where the actual contentious issues are versus what the other side says is contentious, even though it's just their one paid expert saying it's false, when 99 experts that aren't being paid to say something all say it's true. And then, we can go over these last parts. I got sort of briefly touched on, actually, I'm gonna go over this and go over the right part side. I zoomed in too much, I forgot what was there. Although I guess we actually already talked about all that, so never mind. Just try doing the 200% zoom here. Let's see if that's good. So this is an explanation of how the reviews will actually need to work. In the examples I gave, it was more about the content itself. So it's about that study, and is that study good? Is the study true? Is it, who is it paid for by? Who wrote it? So we can spot conflicts of interest. But when we're reviewing how people reference those studies, because that's usually how we're actually going to end up using it in the end, is you'll have people reviewing all these scientific studies and saying what these different snippets mean. And then as people in the media start to reference those studies, you can then start to say, okay, well, this claim here in the media is about that snippet, which we know is either true or not true, or accurate or not accurate. But there's a layer there where we've been talking about the quality of the evidence, right? So is that study good? Was it done by qualified people? Was the study designed properly? All of those things, so that you can separate your high quality evidence from your low quality evidence. But it's also how somebody is referencing it. So you can take a really good high quality study and you can reference it inaccurately. Well, then just because the study is good doesn't mean that you should now trust what that person is saying, because if they're inaccurately referencing a good study, it's still bad information. So we're seeing here there's sort of 4 different quadrants that something can fall into. The ideal one is where you have high quality evidence that's being accurately referenced. That's where the gold is. That's the stuff that you can actually trust. And then you've got either low quality evidence, so stuff that the community looked at and said, I don't know if I would trust this, even if you accurately reference that, still got suspect usefulness. Or you can again have that really high quality piece of evidence that somebody inaccurately references, again, not great. And then there's just the nightmare scenario where it's low quality evidence being inaccurately referenced, and that's just really bad and definitely, yeah, exactly, yikes, as it says there. So in the end, really the only thing that we should be trusting is that green bar. Is that trustworthy? The intersection of high quality evidence being accurately referenced. And that's where, because the media tends to reference the evidence that we're talking about, we can start to review the media sort of content available and start to give it a rating on, are they referencing high quality evidence, and are they doing it accurately? If they are, that's a good piece of media. And then you can start to say, actually, that one, that one referenced good media, but they did it, inaccurately, whether it was just, intentional or not. In the end, all that matters is, are they correct? And if they're not, then maybe, take it with a grain of salt. And then how it can work for sort of trying to summarize that information is, we've got your stances for topic. So this is a very simplified version of it, where if you've got your one of the topics that I plan to do, hopefully fairly early on, because it should stress test it is vaccines, right? So there's arguably more than just the 2 camps, but if we're going to simplify it and say you're either for vaccines or against, or for a certain piece of legislation or not that's related to it, you're going to have people making their stances. But one of the big differences here that I'm trying to do with Wikilection is to have arguments be made with data and not just words, and not just people writing essays where they can cite content and do it inaccurately, and then you're up, the public has to read that and try to decide what's happening. Instead, these stances sort of build up their library of claims, and they say, okay, well, the for side is making these two claims as to why something is true or not, and then the against is making these other claims. One second, let me switch tools here. Is making these other claims. And then underneath, you can see the evidence that's being referenced. So you can see here that like Article 1, the letters underneath say sort of what claims it's, supposedly backing up. So Article 1 supports claims, A and C that are shown here. Claim A is actually backed up by Article 1 and 2 that are a light green because they've been reviewed. The community says it's good. Article 5 hasn't been reviewed enough, so we aren't sure. But it's still got two pieces of evidence backing it up. So that's got a darker green. It's fairly trustworthy. This one here. If you look at claim C, it's referencing, again, Article 1 that's been reviewed and it's good. And the only other thing it's referencing is Article 5 that hasn't been reviewed. So it doesn't have quite as much evidence available, but it's still, overall positive. So it's still kind of a lighter green. And then you have claim E, where it's being backed up by Article 3 that's been actually, it's been proven wrong or inaccurate, and Article 5 that we aren't sure about. So this is so far a net negative. Still not a lot of evidence either way, but one is inconclusive and one is bad, so probably not the most trustworthy. So with the information here, you can see it's kind of easier to say, well, the 4 point has two claims, both of which appear to be true based on the evidence available. The only claim that the against team is making doesn't seem to have good information available. So that sort of helps explain the goal where you can start to take the evidence, you review it, and that starts to help bubble up how trustworthy it is to actually help to solve problems. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me go over some of these.
So that looks like the reasoning mechanism or reasoning model.
Right, totally, yeah. That's again, very early days. I really don't expect almost any of the more complex topics to be able to divide it in just for and against. And then there's things like where a claim is kind of two claims at once. It's either like, this is true or false, or this thing is safe or dangerous, or what it is. And then as claims come in, they'll sort of stack up under either the for or against. So that you can make a claim either direction, right? Saying like a certain ingredient in vaccines is safe or unsafe. That's kind of, two counterpoints to the same claim. And then you can start to see the evidence that piles up for each. As they're being reviewed, you can start to see which evidence is accurate and start to see which of those two claims actually, holds water.
So the evidence sort of equals science and claims equal opinion. Another way of thinking.
Sort of, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's the claims are sort of meant to be the individual things that we're trying to figure out if they're true or not. Like if you're talking about the vaccines, there's a ton of individual claims, right? Like the individual ingredients and whether or not each one is safe. Each one of those is a claim, right? So you say like, is formaldehyde safe? Okay, here's the stuff behind it, right? Here's is it safe in general? Is it safe injected? Is it done this? Here's the evidence for or against. And then you have a claim for each ingredient so that if, a certain ingredient is proven, like, no, we've proven that one is safe, then if people keep going back to saying that it's unsafe, you've just got that library of content already available saying, well, here's all the studies. If you have a new study, by all means, submit it. But right now, it's 98% in that direction. That ingredient does seem to be safe. Sorry. Or you're welcome, depending on how you're doing it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, there's also the issue, though, things that get funded typically are things that are part of that whole academic sphere. And
right.
If you go outside that, there's no funding for it.
Right, true. And one of the important things here will be at the evidence level, tracking who's funding it. So that for things like vaccines, right? Well, one of the common complaints is that it's only being funded by the vaccine companies, which isn't necessarily nefarious, because as you just said, where else is the money coming from? But that's an important thing where I think, for example, in the vaccine conversation, if you weren't tracking who's paying for the research, there's an avenue there that's sort of invisible and people might think of as being dishonest. So the goal is to be as transparent as possible. And then if that bubbles up, oh, this area has only ever been researched by vaccine companies. Okay, if somebody else wants to pay for research, then by all means, they can add it to the pile. But here's what we know right now, which is kind of the basis of the whole thing. Here's what we know right now. It'll always be evolving as more information comes out. It'll kind of have to recalculate. So, if in this example we're showing here, if suddenly claim E had 5 studies come out that prove it, well, now it's actually a stronger point than the other 2. So that might skew the conversation in the other direction now, or the stances, and say, actually, that one's more accurate now. All right, so going over a couple of these comments. Controversial science, yeah. I also figure that with some of the topics I'm talking about, people will complain about the fact that I'm calling some things controversial, but I mean, that's the definition of it. Even if you're 100% and all the evidence points one way, if there's an argument, that's a controversy. And to say that the app wants to be like Wikipedia, a bit. There's elements to it. I mean, that's why the wiki in Wikilection is sort of that community powered or the crowdsourced. But one of the big differences is taking away the emphasis of sort of somebody's ability to sort of craft a well phrase verbiage. And you can have that thing in Wikipedia. You can have a really nice, well-written paragraph that just has a tiny flag saying citation needed. Well, in this world, that wouldn't even be shown. You can't show things that don't have a citation in this because everything is based on that. And
well, this is the model. That's what I meant.
Right, exactly. And with Wikipedia, they have the references area at the bottom. But if you want to dig in, you have to have the skills to be able to dissect and understand that kind of content, and not everyone does. Mm-hmm. And so the idea here is it's an ecosystem based on experts or relevant experts reviewing the content available, and then you can see what that supports. So as you're starting to review those higher level learnings, you can drill in as deep as you want to the point where you could see, oh, here's the 1,000 studies that were reviewed by the community that agree with this. You can go into a certain review for a certain study and start to actually look at the inner workings. So this, yeah, it sounds like maybe what we need is a protocol that structures information into a specific column and format. Yes, and that is going to be based on the kinds of content. So like, for example, a scientific study, there's going to be certain questions that scientists have, about like what, how well was the scientific method applied here? Did you follow, the things to avoid conflicts of interest, and just anything that goes onto a scientist's checklist to review, is this trustworthy or not? That sort of built into the system for, okay, you're now reviewing a scientific article. Here's what the scientific community says is important when we're reviewing that. But those same questions might not be usable on legislation or a treaty or a video interview of someone, or a journalist's sources. So as we get into the different types of evidence, yes, there's definitely going to be sort of a framework where there's going to be different levels as it passes through. So like they're going to have to go through and highlight parts of the scientific study where they might say, okay, show me, sort of like what the outcomes were. Highlight the areas that talk about the outcomes. Highlight the areas where it talks about how the experiment was designed. Highlight the areas where it's talking about how the experiment was implemented. And then the end goal, one of the things that we're doing to avoid, or I guess helping to counter bias, is almost having intentional fake news, but not published. So as people are being asked, is this true? Is this fair? Is this there? We're adding things in that we know aren't true or fair. And we're saying, okay, but if it agrees with you and we know it's untrue or unfair, if you agree with that, that starts to show, okay, that they have some bias in this area. And it's not to say that we don't trust anything that they say, But if we know that like they've said, everything negative about Donald Trump is true, and is important, and half of the stuff were fake articles, maybe that person's not the most trustworthy source for this because they're just saying everything is bad and true. That's not, a trustworthy way to look at it, to actually say, I'm having an unbiased look and here's the true outcome. I hope that made sense to the question being asked. Is this a permanent video that I can permanently link to? Yes. So if you're watching this on YouTube, the same link after we're done just becomes a recording. And so far they've all been left live. Technically, I think I can go back and edit it and chop parts out and blur things out if needed. But so far, they've all just been online on the Wikilection channel. And I think technically on Facebook as well. Okay, I'll check out the video. This is a huge scope. Yes.
Yeah.
No doubt. And it's also in the kind of a scope where this isn't like a project that can be done off the side of the desk. If this is starting to be successful, there will absolutely be groups, that are well funded that are trying to counter it. This is going to end up being a world-class solution to a world-class problem. And it definitely can't just be me. There's going to need to be basically an army of people, like at kind of the top, actually building the product level, at the maintaining the community. But a big part of it is going to be on the community actually doing the reviews. And there's a whole bunch of plans around that. But yes, the scope is massive. And then to say that we need to piece together existing apps, from the research I've done, a lot of the data visualization, I've never seen anything like it. So that part will have to be built. A lot of the other parts, it's not that complex, right? It's just a database with a web front end. Like my day job is I'm a Salesforce admin. I could probably build most of this on Salesforce. I'm not going to because it's not meant for that, and it would end up being super expensive. But those sort of a lot of the tools don't need to be invented. Like a lot of it to just store the information and enter it. But a lot of the sort of unique visualization tools will. So I don't think those could. And the other parts, we'll use existing technologies as far as probably MS, SQL, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what are you thinking about for the database?
I'm not terribly picky. I assume it's going to be, Microsoft SQL, but I'm open to.
Are you familiar with GraphQL?
No, I'm not a developer. I know very little about like the architecture and the programming languages and that kind of thing. That's something where I'm right now starting to draft up the really early day specs, more just to get something online that I can make iterative improvements to. And a part of that conversation will be deciding on at least the early days, what environments to use, what languages, and so on. So if you have any recommendations, I'm definitely open to them. And then to answer a question that comes up a lot after this conversation, it's not necessarily going to use or not use blockchain, right? If that becomes a necessity and the community definitely wants it, I'm open to it. But for right now, the more important
I would suggest you go with holochain instead of blockchain.
Okay.
Yeah. That's why the database choice is so essential, because if you want to eventually bridge over into the holochain ecosystem, you need to use, I think they're focused on GraphQL as a database, so that it makes it easier, in the end, to just get that all over there.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I imagine with the first coded prototype, I'm not really even worried if that just lasts for a year and then I have to code something else from scratch. And when I say I mean I get someone else to do it.
Right.
But yeah,
understandable. I'm just talking about the long-term vision for where you want it to end up, because data is, as you know, one of the most sensitive issues, right? Who controls the data? Is it agent-centric? Is it going through a central server, right?
Totally.
Because you don't want people messing with it at the end of the day.
Exactly. And this is going to be a really, fairly unique in its need for both transparency and extreme security. But a lot of times those are mutually exclusive in areas. So that there's going to be that balancing act of having it be as transparent as possible to keep it, so people can trust it, but not having it be transparent in the areas where it can start to, have it being open to gaming and trolls and security issues and stuff like that, right? Like the algorithm that powers it will have to be partially transparent, but then also a bit like the Google, if we make it too transparent, people are going to learn how to, to game it to a T, and then that makes the whole thing useless.
Absolutely. You've fallen into game A. Ooh, rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I'm a bit unique in the game B space where I don't think of game A as a bad word. Like I am fine with a lot of parts of it. I think there's room for improvements. And I think that while we're still building game B and the architecture, where there isn't a solution, we shouldn't be hesitant to borrow like tools from game A.
Absolutely.
There's things that you don't do.
That's why I'm talking about the bridging, right? So right. The thing is, where are you headed? Even if you're, in game A and you use elements, what is the end game? Are you going to become agent, centric, decentralized, or you stay centralized?
The end goal, for the technical part of, is it on blockchain, is it on holochain, is it decentralized or what? I think that will kind of come out in the wash as we start to have technical conversations and people in the community say, we won't trust it unless it's X. That will start to make some of those choices clear.
It's interesting that, you see, I started from the opposite end. It was absolutely the most important thing was to determine what space it would be built in. That was my starting point.
Right.
Yeah. Not something that would evolve. It was like essentially that I figured
if I had strong opinions on the topic, I probably would have started there as well. But because I don't, I think that's going to be, some mistakes will definitely be made there. I'm aware that even though I'm going to be paying for this upcoming prototype out of pocket, that's likely going to end up going in the garbage. But it just so that there's something online so I can start to build on it and start to iterate. And yeah, there will almost certainly be like a full rehash at some point in the life cycle. But I want to start doing stuff and not just talking about it.
Of course. And because my choice was based on security and privacy. I think yours is going to be based around data, right? Because clearly this data.
There's also going to be a huge emphasis on security and data, and on how to say this, like confirming people are who they say they are. Because, for example, if you can't vote in an election, you don't get to vote on the election issues in that election. You can vote on election issues in your own election. But like, I can't vote on election issues in the U.S., right? And like, I can't vote on election issues in Alberta, but I could vote in BC and in Surrey. But like any area where I'm able to vote, now I can participate in here's what voters say is important to them in these election issues.
Yeah, so I think for a use case, selecting a small town or a small area that's having an election and going in there or reaching out and trying to apply that to that particular election, wouldn't that be a really good use case to start?
Yep. That's the goal for like the actual sort of life, like the implementation of the project is once we actually have a somewhat decent prototype available, the goal is to work in just like a local municipal election, where even if we have to hard code a couple of things just to get it there, so it's sort of showing as much as possible.
Yeah.
And and I've actually got a pretty good hookup in that area, so that's
great.
Going to be fairly easy for me. I think that part of it is just actually getting the prototype available. Will be, the more challenging part, and then to make sure that there's enough feedback from other people that it's not just me what I think is important, so that there's a better chance that when it actually, is in front of people, they can see the use and they can get some use out of it. Keep scrolling through these comments. Okay. Oh, 1 second. I do plan to put this presentation online at some point. The whole point of this presentation, like from my point of view, is really to help improve these explanations and like start to figure out which infographics work and what don't. and then eventually actually have somebody who's a bit more graphical, build them in something that's not Google Draw, so that we can start to actually, because in the end, the goal is to have the website be a bit better at sort of explaining things.
Yeah, I think you need to hire a UX designer to go through the whole, like the flow and the
100%.
and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Even before you get to the graphical, right? You need to, that go to that state where you.
Yeah, exactly. You need the UX before the UI.
Yes, good.
Something like that. Oh yeah, I thought I was like, I lost it earlier, but for the talks about sort of the long-term plans for Wikilection, one of my hopes is that Together Tech ends up getting to the point where it is sort of a community-owned cooperative that can own tech projects, and eventually to basically have them be the ones that sort of own and run Wikilection, so that it is not, it's not a single person that owns it. Because right now, Wikilection actually is incorporated in BC, because I set up a Kickstarter last year that didn't end up going anywhere. But I wanted to have like an actual business account, so I wasn't taxed personal and that whole thing. But the eventual goal is I don't want to be the one that owns it, because I think that's one mark against it if it's owned by a single person, because then that person
by the commons.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I personally want Together Tech to end up being, is either commons or like a co-op or something where it's not a single person, and something where it's definitely not profit driven. Like that has to be baked in, because I think that's one of the key areas where people don't trust things in the political area, is if you're profit driven, where you're getting your money from, who owns your company, that whole thing, which skews the like, okay, so where shouldn't I trust this person or this organization?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I think he said also he said up for food. So that's, I think, about it for what I wanted to cover. I'm not sure if you had any outstanding questions.
Not at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today. It was nice to get some more some feedback.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I really like this model that you've got here. It explains explains what's going on.
My end goal is to sort of have, like, which I think may have been what Steve was kind of hinting at, is to build the three modules separately and then start to build them together to where they connect. And I think that the scientific discussion part could possibly be used to do some of that treaty like breakdown and analysis stuff that you were doing.
I'm the lights are going off as you're speaking as to how this could work.
Yeah, so that's, because when you were talking about it, I'm like, oh, I think I've got the perfect thing. I mean, it's not built yet. So if you find something that already does this, well, A, you should probably use it, and B, please let me know, because I haven't seen anything like that. But because with all this, I am trying to keep it like an eye out for other tools that are already doing it. A, because if somebody gets their before I do, that's fine, but I probably shouldn't waste too much effort there. But then it's also just to sort of see what else is out there, know like, oh, that's a good idea, I hadn't thought about that. And so like on the politics side, I've seen quite a bit. On the news side, on the science side, I haven't really seen anything that does it.
Yeah, that one thing that came up with respect to the user group. So you mentioned members and experts, and then you mentioned the word media. So a lot of this, you said, I mean, kind of would be sourced from media, but I think as you grow it, eventually media would use it as a reference.
Right, which is an interesting segue to this diagram. Oh, let me zoom out a little bit. I think this is probably fine. Oh, I should zoom. Okay. I have to get a better zoom for this. So this is an example of exactly that, of sort of how the current information works, where the public is on the outside. They get their information through what I'm calling channels, right, where that's going to be either like an actual, a TV station, radio news, a YouTube channel, any sort of source of information. When they're trying to like explain sort of important or complex topics, they'll typically use an expert, even if that's themselves, right? Some small YouTube channels you might have the expert be the same person as the media if it's just, a single scientist with their own YouTube channel. They're kind of acting as both. But effectively, you've got channels that are using experts to understand the underlying evidence in the middle. And then, your flow is the evidence is you use as proof to build a story. And then the story has to make it through the channel, where in the news, of course, there's your typical challenges of like, you've got your editorial bias where you're just skewing things in a certain direction, where you're sensationalizing and taking things that maybe don't need to be news stories and making them into it because you have some quotas to fill, or you're just not covering certain topics because they don't align with the story you're trying to tell. Then your experts are the people that they refer to, right? Where you've got like your scientists, politicians, economists, journalists, and so on. And they, of course, can still be biased. They can have conflicts of interest. And we're seeing this a lot now in the conversation around COVID-19, where people are bringing out scientists, but if you look into it, it's like they're a physicist. Okay, it's not to say that they can't have any input, but I'm not sure if their PhD is relevant here. If they're if they have a PhD in physics, and we're talking about a virus. And then finally, you've got the evidence in the middle that sort of everything in theory is based on. And then your issues there are, is that piece of evidence verified? Is it being accurately referenced? And even if it is, is that one piece of evidence out of maybe 10 pieces where 9 of them disagree with it, and you just pick the one that agree? How does the public see that? And then sort of what comes out the other side is the Wikilection model, where you've got the evidence is just this pool of evidence in the middle that's been reviewed by experts. Those experts are then tracked, for their links to different industries, how qualified they are, et cetera. And so you end up with, again, this sort of pool of evidence that's been reviewed and can now be cited. And then as well, not only can you then learn like what's being said, but we're also reviewing the media available, grouping those into events, so you can sort of start to see the important events going on, and we can almost start to link up. So like one of the things that would be great if this gets mature is like a browser extension. So if you're reading a news article, it can say, hey, by the way, here's 5 other articles on that same topic. The community agrees that the article you're reading, it cites this really cherry-picked slice of data. We thought you might want to know about this. Or if you're watching a video on Facebook that's been, that's been reviewed and has snippets and has people review it, to be able to overlay that review and those snippets into Facebook. So any video you're seeing that has information available, it can say, by the way, this part of the video is true, but that part's not. But yeah, so I just wanted to show this because this is sort of, I think what you're talking about on the left is typical media, and on the right is it kind of becomes a media channel, but it's also kind of a non-channel, where it's just this collection of evidence and expert reviews and the important events going on and what the media are saying about it. And then you can tell Wikilection what you're interested in, what categories are interested in. And then it can show, okay, based on what you've said you're interested in, here's what's going on. Here's the events, here's the media, here's the the evidence. And it's not quite the same where right now Facebook tends to silo us into not just a topic, but what do you think about that topic? Like you can say you're interested in vaccines, but on Facebook, you either join a pro-vax or anti-vax group. So you're in that bubble. On this, if you say you're interested in vaccines, great. We're going to tell you everything that we know about vaccines, but you don't get to filter it if it agrees with you or not. You just said vaccines, so we're going to show you everything on vaccines.
Yeah, so it's like tip of the iceberg is the proof. And then what we see is above that is the story and the channels. But what you're building out is all of the stuff below the tip of the iceberg.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like the story and the media is that tip. And then you can't see all the stuff underneath that, like, I don't know, there's 4 icebergs I can see. Maybe one of them is safe to navigate next to, but I'd have to be able to see underneath to know which
how
one
deep,
I can
how deep and how large is all of that stuff underneath.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, once it's built, it'll be very solid. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's I mean, there's a lot of ifs and a lot of challenges to go through on the way, but I see Steve making comments again in a second. So Orthodox communication system. Yeah, that is the part on the left is meant to be sort of the typical, the way that media is presented to people. Where, and I think your second thing there saying, notice that the evidence has to pass through the self-interest of the experts and then pass through the influence of the channels. Exactly. So you can have the expert where if if they're biased or have a conflict of interest, or they just aren't looped into the conversation, that's one way it can be excluded. And then you've also got, you can have an expert that says this is important, but then they take it to their channel that they're trying to go through, and they say, no, that's not newsworthy, or that doesn't fit in with our narrative, or whatever the reason is. There's a lot of chances where important evidence doesn't get to the public.
Mm-hmm.
From source evidence to public knowledge are 2 or 3 rings of diffraction and distortion of the evidence. Some evidence will never be shared with experts. Some evidence will not share. Yeah, that's true. And of course, we're still going to be limited to some of that, right? If we can't get access to the evidence, we can't do anything with it. But a part of this will also be, once we can start to see this slice of evidence start to be available, there's a lot of things, especially if we start to get users, and start to get some push. There's things like maybe making agreements with like different, scientific report repositories, where we can sort of figure out how much of it can we store locally, how can we reference it out. If it's a link out and somebody has to pay for it, how can we reference that somebody actually did pay for it? So when they say they read it, we actually can say, yeah, they read it. They bought the study from Nature. So that it's reasonable to assume they probably did actually go through and read it. Yeah, there's tons of areas here. And this is, I'm sure somebody actually in media might, pull their hair out looking at this very simplistic diagram, but it's really just sort of meant to compare the current model to what things might be like with Wikilection in a way that's somewhat digestible through an image. Even this is going to end up being very sort of oversimplified, even for things just like, not just is the content good, but are they referencing it accurately? That's being hard to show in graphics, so that's why I talk about it, but I haven't found a way to show that visually yet.
Yeah, well, you're talking about a complex system.
Yeah,
so,
with a lot of this. And that's my main challenge now. And that's sort of, it's trying to get people interested to both A, get feedback, and B, like either fund a Patreon or a Kickstarter so we can actually start to develop this. So we'll take that off. All right, are there any final questions on the tons of stuff that we've covered so far? Doesn't sound like it. All right, well, thank you, Susan, for joining on video, and thank you, Steve, for joining by chat on YouTube. That was a lot of good comments and feedback from both areas there. It was this was, I would say, easily the best live stream so far. There was a lot of good feedback and questions and back and forth. It was cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I will end the stream here if you guys want to stick around. Or I guess, Susan, if you want to stick around, I think it technically ends the chat capabilities, but thank you again, Steve, for your input.
Thanks, Steve.